My nearly 2500 rated opponent was so mad about losing this seemingly unlosable position with white that they decided to block me right after this game. And no, they didn't lose on time as you might expect. They actually managed to lose this position here with the white pieces up 2 pawns, where only white can win and black is simply groveling for the draw. In fact, they were even up on time with 1 minute 26 to my 1 minute and 5 seconds. But before we get started on how I swindled this totally losing game, I am going to quickly recap how exactly this position was reached because the tactics were pretty interesting. It all started with me going for this crazy move knight to g4 rather than taking the knight on b5 because I didn't really like my pawn structure getting damaged, though looking back on it this was just a misevaluation. Instead of all that, I went for this move trying to exploit the pin here and going for knight to e3. I saw a couple of nice tactics with stuff like queen to d2, knight to b3 with a fork, and also queen to d3, knight to e5, which would hit the queen and also hit the pawn. So I saw these ideas and was like, this looks pretty nice, I'm gonna go for this, exploiting the pin here. But really it was just getting way too fancy because they just grabbed my knight and now I am very sad. Because this square on e3 is covered by the bishop and I have to take back, after which the queen now takes back and the e3 square is covered once again, queen's out of danger, and really I have nothing, just gave up a pawn. So I retreated the knight back, they moved the rook to the center, I played rook to e8, normal developing, somehow the engine thinks that this is about equal. I was not feeling too good about the position at this point, but I did have a couple tricks. After e4 they blunted my queen, but rook to b8, and now I am threatening, or at least I thought I was threatening, to win the pawn on c4, after which the queen takes. I wanted to take the knight here and then also go after the b2 pawn. Now they play this really nice move rook to f2. Engine gives it a miss, but I think it's a really classy way to defend the b2 pawn and also prevent knight takes on c4 from being any good, because after knight takes on c4, queen takes on c4, I take the knight, they took my pawn, and now b2 is no longer hanging with a check. So I moved my queen to the center, they grabbed it. I thought it was a nice little tactic because I get to grab on b2, but after they take my queen, I can take the rook with a check, but what I missed is that after the end of this sequence, they have the move rook to d5. If it wasn't for that move, then this would be a pretty easily drawable position. I could just move the rook back, harass this pawn here, and the 4-on-3 is not normally sufficient. It's a bit of a pain to defend, but it should be doable. Instead, they went for rook to d5, and this king and pawn endgame is completely losing because they can just walk the king in and absolutely dominate mine. I'm just going to show one line, for example. After the king runs in, my king runs in. I'm eventually going to run out of moves. They could just go over and take my pawn, and eventually I will either be forced out and they'll get this pawn through, or if I go on the defensive and then try and stop the pawn from promoting, then they can just run away and start to take all of my pawns over here, using this pawn as a decoy, and my king would be left for dead. So I can't trade the rooks if I want any hope of trying to draw. I move my rook back now looking for this infiltration. What's pretty instructive about this is that if this e-pawn was removed from the position, this would normally be a pretty standard draw because I'd be able to get my rook behind the a3 pawn, play g6, h5, king g7, and then just stall with the king, and they could never really make any progress. I'll show you why in a couple moves. So they took the pawn, I went rook b6, delivered a check, played h5. I thought this was a tricky little move because if they take the pawn, then I play rook to b3, they move the king up, I can take the pawn. And I thought I might have some drawing chances here. Engine tells me I'm a fool, but obviously my opponent kind of believed me because they said, yeah, nah, I'm not taking that pawn and giving you my a pawn, and instead they just moved their king up. But now I can consolidate with g6. They played a4, king g7, and the winning technique here for white is actually a bit counterintuitive. And the reason for that is because the further you push this pawn up the board, actually the less ranks the white rook has to operate on, and the more ranks my black rook will have to operate on. Instead, what you want to do is try and create a weakness on the king side with g4 and pawn takes on h5, which would then deflect my pawn away from this very nice chain that I created and allow their king to go in and try and do some damage. So I'll show you what that might look like. I kept stalling, they moved their rook back, I was shuffling here, giving some checks, and instead of running the king away, what they should have tried to go for, once again, is pawn to g4. The reason this is so nice is because if I go for something like takes, say I move my king back, and they start pushing, then eventually what's going to happen is my king is going to get dragged out of this g7 square. So let's say I play rook to a3, they can play h6 with a check, and I cannot take the pawn. If I take the pawn, they deliver rook to h8 check, and promote to a queen. And if I go to h7, then they can just walk the king up, take on f7, start pushing this e-pawn as well. My rook can never really do anything other than give a check and move back, because it's tied down to stopping this rook to h8 check tactic to promote. And black is just completely losing here. But luckily for me, my opponent didn't know the technique. So what they started doing was actually just floundering around with the king. I kept giving checks, and while this pawn to g4 move is possible, white is winning. But after they played f4, I felt so relieved, and I knew that at this moment there might even be a chance for a little swindle if my opponent tries to overpress. The reason why f4 now draws the game is because g4 is no longer possible. If they play g4, I'll just capture it, right? And if they play e6, I take it. If they play f5, I take it. So all of these pawns are not able to move, and somehow these 4 pawns are fended off by my 3 pawns. And I'll show you why this endgame is also a draw if all 3 of these pawns disappear and only the h pawn or the a pawn are there. It's pretty useful to know why that is a draw. So if we just fast forward to this possible position, then you can see that this is a draw because the king is completely bare in the middle of the board. My king is just going to sit on a7 forever, and the black rook is just going to patrol the a file. The white rook can never move because we'll take the pawn. And if the king ever tries to go over and help out the rook, then we'll just check it away and deliver checks from behind, and we'll make the draw. So back to the position, f4, I'm feeling good, start to deliver some checks from behind, check the king, move back, they play e6, and just like the prophecy suggested, all of the pawns start to get traded off. They run the king around, trade off a couple more pawns, I give some checks. There's nothing really for them to do. And g4, what looks like a perfectly reasonable move, Engine of course gives it as the best because it thinks everything is a draw, actually starts to give black some chances, especially if white is still convinced that they are the one winning the game, right? I give the check now, the king's forced back, and we've actually managed to win a pawn. It's not much, and if white wants to make the draw, of course they can. They can just move the rook back, go over and take my pawn. But white's been winning this whole time. White's been winning for over 2 minutes at this point, and they really want to secure those 8 points in the bag. So instead of that, they play h5. I continue giving checks, defend my pawn, move the king over, give some more checks, and weirdly enough, they actually decided not to take the pawn, probably because this is once again an easy draw. I'm just going to deliver checks from the side, deliver checks from behind, go back to defend the pawn, and there's no way that they're going to rout my king out of h7. But once they decline the pawn, I give some more checks, and it's at this moment where they have 11 seconds, I have 23, that I notice, you know what, maybe Gary's got a shot. Maybe Gary can do it. He goes g3, and this pawn's actually kind of getting annoying to stop. My opponent starts to panic a little bit here, only 11 seconds left on the clock. They're like, what the hell, I'm maybe losing? They move the rook to the side. Of course, I've got to take this pawn. I do take it, and after they move the rook back to b2, a critical mistake in time pressure. They had to go rook to b1. Probably I would have flagged them still, but at least this way they can get behind the pawn. Instead, with rook to b2, we actually have a killer move here. Try and spot it before I give it away, but the move is pawn to g2. Shoving that pawn through, rook to g7 also works okay, fair enough. But pawn to g2, I like this a lot, especially because after the move rook to b1, you can really rub it in their face, promote to a rook, given a brilliant move by chess.com. Nasty, nasty stuff. This is actually a fork on the king and the rook, deflecting the rook into the skewer, rook to g7, king moves, and we take the rook to win this rook and king versus king. But instead of that, we just see g2, they take the pawn, I give them a check, they move out of the way, and I take the rook. They resign the game and immediately decided to block me. Personally, I think that was a bit much. If you're going to play blitz, you know what you're getting yourself into. As the great Gordon Ramsay says, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. And if my opponent can't handle getting swindled in a blitz game, then they will not be missed. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this game. Never resign, always grovel, and I'll see you all in another video. Bye.